So this session is going to be on combating violent extremism, making communities safer. And the context of it, as you've seen in your form, is that since 9/11 and 7/7, not only has the world given the appearance of becoming less insecure, but we have moved from a period of security into insecurity. And the challenges that we face are both in how do we combat violent extremism, but also how do we build cohesive communities. They do appear to be two sides of the same coin. We've got a great panel assembled here, and what I intend to do is to run the session in three parts. So in a moment, we'll have our keynote speaker, Lord John Alderdice, who will speak for around 10 to 15 minutes. And then we'll have Zubeda Limbado, who will introduce, from Connect Futures, who will introduce two short films. And then we'll have a response from Martha Spurrier, the new Director of Liberty, and then a moderated Q&A discussion. So it promises to be a really invigorating and a tough session in terms of some of the topics, but I look forward to sharing that with you in a moment. But first and foremost, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Lord John Alderdice.
Thank you very much indeed for the kind introduction. And thank you very much to the Vice-Chancellor of the University, to Mike Hardy, the head of the Centre, and also to Kieran and Eva and all the band of people that have done so much to put this tremendous event together. It's really good to be back in Coventry. And it's good to hear the stories of particularly positive things that have been happening. That marvellous description of the signs of hope in Lebanon. And it's very tempting for me to add some more of my own and say there are lots of good things happening here and here and here and here. But I'm wary of doing that, not just because I'm a bit of a perverse individual, but because I think if we're to take seriously the degree of difficulty we face in the world, we've got to look at the other side of things. I listened to Andrew Mitchell giving an excellent and very inspiring speech. But he started by talking about the responsibility to protect and finished talking about the lessons of the Treaty of Westphalia. The Treaty of Westphalia is in direct contradiction to the responsibility to protect. It sets up that there are nation states with leaders, in fact, leaders whose religion should become the religion of their state. And we've come to the responsibility to protect in direct confrontation with that whole structure that has lasted for so long. Now, I know that there is a postmodern notion that if you say two opposite things within the same sentence, that's the beginning of wisdom. But I'm afraid I don't start there, because I grew up in a situation where there were good people doing good things and getting hammered for it, and where the situation simply got worse. And since the marvellous first Rising 2015, in the last 12 months, between then and now, the situation has not got better, despite of all the clever things that we said then, despite of our commitments. So I want to try to say one or two things that may be a little challenging, and to say them at this stage so that we can think about them during the rest of the time. Because it's very easy for us to get together and say what other people should be doing, what the government should be doing, what other governments should be doing, what changes there should be. And we will work very hard to do our bit, but saying somebody else should do something rarely has much impact other than to make us feel it's somebody else's job. The event describes its slogan as the ripple effect. So what is the ripple effect? Well, the ripple effect is imitation. It's mimesis. It's identification. It's you picking up on something that I did and somebody else picking up on what you do, and so it causes a ripple. It's a psychological effect. Actually, we're beginning to understand it's not merely a psychological effect. Functional magnetic resonance imaging in the last few years has shown that there are neurons in our brain, which are being called mirror neurons, precisely because they pick up the way somebody else is responding and imitate that in the way that we respond. And we know that any of you bringing up children will know that if they won't put something in their mouth, what do? You put the spoon into your mouth and then you put it into their mouth. We are extremely imitative creatures. But we don't just imitate what other people do. We take into ourselves what other people want. We imitate their desires. And the problem about this is, once we start to imitate their desires, we get into conflict and rivalry with each other. Why? Because if I want what you want, then we've got a conflict. And it's one of the essential problems that we have as human beings living in society, is the fact that when we imitate each other, we get into rivalry with each other, and then we get into conflict. And the whole of society has emerged to try to find ways of ensuring that that essential, fundamental part of the human condition leads not to violence, but to some kind of coming together. And so we have constructed religion, culture, and law precisely to give us the possibility of living together. But the difficulty about it is that the only way we have found to make this work is by coming together against someone else, creating scapegoats. And since Christ was around, we've come to the recognition that the scapegoat is not actually someone who's guilty. We choose the scapegoat, but we no longer have the absolute conviction that the scapegoat is really guilty of anything at all. However, we still have not found another mechanism to deal with this. And when I was trying to work, for example, in the peace process in Northern Ireland, it was always very important to try to find somebody else against whom we could all unite. Very often it was the British government. All people in Northern Ireland, Unionist, Nationalist, Republican and Loyalist, can all agree that perfidious Albion, the British government, is a major part of the problem. Or maybe we would get together at a conference meeting and I'd wonder, how are we going to get these disparate politicians together? And it was very easy to say to them, you know, as we walked in the door, the journalists outside there were saying that we're a crowd of charlatans, that we have no intention of ever delivering a peace, that it isn't even possible for us. But together we can find a way. And all the politicians could say, that's absolutely right, the journalists are being unfair to us. The point is that we have not found a way of easily dealing with this rivalry, this imitation, this identification. And we need to understand this. Our desires are actually what we see of others. And as in the last couple of generations, the whole business of me and my desire, and me filling my desire and fulfilling my desire, and the breaking down of boundaries and borders, and a commitment to religion and certain cultures and even the rule of law, has meant we have inevitably descended into increasing violence and chaos. This is not some kind of arbitrary thing that has just happened. There are reasons for it. We are sliding down into the third global conflict. And we need to understand that that is where we are, and it's extremely dangerous. And particularly those of a liberal disposition find it very difficult to appreciate that some of the things that are so important to us, things like freedom to move, to trade, to travel, getting rid of boundaries, all being together on things, allowing people to have what they want, that these actually are part of the problem with which we live. And when people say, as they've been saying already in the conference, government should do such and such a thing which we believe is right, let's not forget, government gets elected by people, and the majority of people do not share those views. And so when you push them very hard, what happens is governments are elected that will go in exactly the opposite direction from the one you want. This is a real challenge. It's not a pretend challenge. If you were surprised by the result of the Brexit referendum, if you were surprised by the election of Donald Trump, you haven't been paying attention. You haven't been looking at the way elections in this country have been going for some years. Just because some people didn't get elected doesn't mean they didn't have large numbers of votes. But of course it wasn't acceptable. It wasn't the way we wanted to believe. It wasn't the case that the world was the one we wanted to be living in. But it is the one we've got. And our job is to try to make the best of it within the limits of the humanity that we all share, for good and ill. So what does this mean? It means we've got to take seriously the idea that boundaries actually matter. And that we and our part of the world may contribute to some of the problems in other places. When Al-Qaeda started, do you remember what they actually said? It's very difficult sometimes for people in the West to understand what's going on at these terrorist organizations. Why? Because we don't listen to what they actually say. Almost all terrorist organizations tell you exactly why they're doing what they're doing. It's not a secret. What did AQ say? AQ said this. It said, look, you guys in the West keep talking about human rights and democracy and sharing out the wealth of the community. And yet your allies in our part of the world don't respect human rights, don't respect democracy, and don't share out the wealth. And you keep them supported. And the only way we think we can get rid of you and get you out of our area is by violence, because nothing else seems to have worked. We started off, 100 years ago, there were liberal democracies in that region. Then it moved to pan-Arab nationalism. Then it moved to authoritarianism. Now it's breaking down into complete chaos. And the intervention of the West hasn't been something that has helped that. Do we understand the contribution that we make to this? I remember very well when the whole question of Syria arose. And I said to my colleagues in the House of Lords, do not put as a requirement getting rid of Assad, because you have no idea what you will put in its place. You live in a fantasy land about a whole bunch of people who are opposing Assad and they'll all work together. Well, they won't work together. And one of my colleagues said to me, John, it can't possibly get any worse. I said, it is possible for it to get worse. And what is more, it is going to get worse. And it has, and it will spread. Because that ripple effect isn't always a ripple effect of good things. When we were doing the Northern Ireland peace process, world leaders, people like Mandela and Clinton and Gorbachev, believed that being a leader was about resolving conflict. And they were good models. And the imitation and the ripple effect was a positive one. But global leaders now believe that being a leader means how do you conduct conflicts, not resolve them. And you don't need to put names to it to know exactly who we're speaking about, because it's almost every country in every part of the world if you look at the recent elections. And we need to take that seriously. We are not living in good times. The mimesis, the imitation, the identifications that we have for young people now are not such positive ones. It doesn't have to be like that, but that is the way it is at the moment. And if we're going to change it, we've got to think very seriously about what it involves. So, for example, if people want the United Nations to do something, then the Security Council is going to have to agree on it. Otherwise, it won't happen. The United Nations is a table where people negotiate. If the Security Council is going to agree something, then it means that the 5 permanent members have got to be prepared to agree to it. That means that you've got to negotiate with Beijing and with President Putin. And frankly, there's no point in creating more difficulties in that relationship and then hoping that something good will come out of it, because you say, we have moral rectitude on our side, therefore you've got to do such and such. Do you think he's going to be impressed? People in that part of the world look at the West and they don't see it as a shining bright light of moral rectitude. That's the reality. So I think that as we struggle with these difficult questions, we do have to accept the world is not the one we would like, that humanity does not live by the rules that we might think are best, that we are profoundly influenced by our feelings, especially our feelings of anger, hurt, humiliation, resentment, and that when these arise, they can lead to terrible violence and splits, and that is what we are now experiencing. And therefore, we are going to have to find ways of living and working with people we don't like and we don't agree with and who don't hold to the same kinds of views and values as us, and not contributing to deeper polarization. When the Brexit debate arose, some of my colleagues, knowing that I was pro-European and always had been so, said, John, we want you to run a campaign in Northern Ireland for pro-Remain. I said, I have no intention of doing it. They said, why? I said, because I'll tell you the result of that. The result of that will be to have all the nationalists and the Alliance Party lining up for Remain and all the unionists lining up for Brexit, and all we will have done is recreate the split that we've been spending most of our lives trying to heal. They said, well, what are you going to do? Just do nothing? I said, no. We're going to create a public conversation about this issue because there hasn't been a proper public conversation. And we're going to invite along to that conversation people we don't agree with. And we will bring Nigel Farage over to Northern Ireland. And some of them said, oh, for goodness sake, you've enough problems there without inviting Nigel Farage. I said, he is part of the community and he represents a lot of people who take those views in Northern Ireland. And if we're going to have a conversation, rather than just pat ourselves on the back and deepen the split, then we've got to engage with people we don't agree with. I remember when we had some discussions about going into coalition between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, and some of my Lib Dem colleagues said, oh, we can't possibly go into a coalition with the Conservatives. And I said, why not? You told us we were all great folks in Northern Ireland when the DUP and Sinn Féin, who'd actually been killing each other, went into coalition together. Whatever else your opponents have been doing here, they haven't been running terrorist campaigns against each other. And they said, oh my goodness, I never thought of it that way. So we had a public conversation in Northern Ireland. And do you know something? That conversation did not have the vitriol that the debate over on this side of the water had. And the Ulster Unionist Party decided that they would support Remain. And the Democratic Unionist Party said, we've thought about it, we've considered it, and on balance, we're going to vote for Brexit. On balance. That's not usually a term that's used a lot in Northern Ireland politics in the old days. But it is now. Because we've had to be prepared to accept the reality of the way people are, the way people feel, the impact of history upon us, the things we need to do, the people we need to work with, showing them respect even when we don't agree with them, if we are going to model a new way of engaging. And it's going to be very difficult and very tough. Do not hope that you will come away from Rising seeing a tsunami of progress. What we are trying to build are ripples of hope. Thank you.
Zubaida is a director of Connect Futures and has 16 years' experience of working on the ground with the very protagonists that John Alderdice spoke about. And Zubaida, I understand that you're going to be introducing 2 films that gives a flavour of some of the work that you do, and then we'll have a discussion about that.
So hopefully in the next few minutes you will see 2 videos which will be launched more officially around December. So you're getting a sneak preview. And one will be a former far-right extremist called Nigel, who's from Coventry. And the other lady that you'll see is Jasmine, who is from London, who used to be a recruiter around Islamist extremism. And if you tune in around in December, in the first week of December, we'll be launching around 5 videos with the more provocative, if I give the titles, the recruiter, the leader, the believer, the accidental, and the activist. And these are stories of individuals who are former extremists, so from Coventry through to Iraq, through to Germany. And if you go on our website around that time on connectfutures.org, you'll see the full set of videos. So today, you'll see just the 2 of the videos.
We were passionate about helping women. We wanted them to be protected. And we wanted to create a revolution. We wanted to make history. This was the first organization where women were becoming activists. My name is Jasmine Marcus. I'm from London. I grew up in Derby. That was a time when I was in foster care due to the fact that both of my parents had divorced. I stayed with this family for the next 14 years. Unfortunately, during my years being with this particular family, I went through so much abuse and I was put into foster care again. Now, the abuser actually denied some of the stuff that he did to me. My case was going to court when I was 15 years old, and eventually, they dropped the case because they said there was not enough evidence. The upsetting point in my life at that time, being a 15-year-old, is when you're not believed. And I think this was a time when I questioned about, myself, and I even started doubting myself. Unfortunately, there was a point in my life where I did attempt suicide because I'd given up. You wonder who's out there for you. You're not believed. Eventually, when I met my husband, I settled down. I saw him that he was quite practicing, in Islam, and I started researching about Islam. I was very much attracted to Abu Ala Madudi's Fundamentals of Islam, which really addressed, simple things in life, how we tackle like black magic or superstitions, and we really need to go straight to the direct connection with God, and we don't need all these talisman or anything, just go straight to him, which is probably one of the main reasons why I then took into the direction of joining the other extremist group, was the fact that in an Islamic state, for which they called, you would have a judicial system where you would bring your perpetrator to justice. So imagine I was not believed, and all of a sudden there's this great state that we need to now work towards, and therefore my perpetrator would be brought to justice. In 1996 we saw genocide taking place in Bosnia, and then we also saw the influx of Somali refugees, and I started waking up to the fact that yes, the Muslim countries are being attacked, and because I felt the injustices that was done towards me, I could empathize then with the Muslim Ummah, as you would say. This is when we then formed our women's group. The whole purpose was to become the voice, the eyes and the ears of the Muslims. The verse that was drummed into us was Surah 3 verse 104. Let there arise amongst you group or groups, calling society to the good and forbidding evil, and those shall be the successful ones. This verse stood out to us because we felt that we have now become God's representatives, and therefore it was our duty now to work towards establishing the Islamic State. Whenever you join a new group, everything is so hunky-dory, you get on with all the sisters, but then you see that things are not always rosy. You see the personality problems, you see the power trip that takes place, you see the exploitation. And spiritually we found eventually that we were dying. We just started questioning about, well, what is Islam about? And studying about the Prophet, peace be upon him, and looking at what we were implementing over here or how we were interacting with the public was totally different. My father's friend, who's the lecturer at a university, is a philosopher, and he questioned me about how and when we get the Islamic State, what would we do? How would we build it? Again, I was stuck. I mean, it was all rosy to have these great pictures in your head. He then said to me, he said, I've read about the Prophet, peace be upon him. He was an ambassador for all humankind. The way you young people are carrying his message is, on the contrary, it's full of violence and it's full of hate. It's not what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught. And he was right. I couldn't fault him for that. And he said to me one thing. He said, I've heard this great scholar say that Islam is known for its dominions and not for its domination. It's not to dominate. And that's when slowly but surely the bubble was bursting. Once we have taken the veil of prejudices out, away from our eyes, that's when we will be able to see humanity again. And that's why I say to a lot of people that whenever someone comes to dictate, you have the right to challenge them. Because remember, one day we're going to be questionable to the one above.
My mum and dad always taught me to ask questions, and it's like if you believed in something, then you stood up for it. But it was always about knowing the facts. People ask me what was my biggest mistake, and after thinking about it, I think my biggest mistake was picking up that leaflet. Somebody said to me about the National Front. I just thought, they hated black people, they wanted to send black people home. And other than that, I didn't really know much about them.
It's a tragedy for Britain, a tragedy for the British people.
Well, of course, there are far too many immigrants in this country.
It used to be talk about it was pro-family values, it was pro-British industry. So I thought, okay, it was anti-drugs as well, and that was really important, because I had a friend who went through a big drug issue and then he ended up dying. And the fact that the NF were anti-drugs, I thought that was quite, it was a good thing being anti-drugs, and that sort of got me involved in it then. I'd be leafleting, stickering, but then you had the big social side of it, so you'd be going to concerts, you'd be going to football, you know, you'd be meeting up just for a drink to talk about plans for the next week, for marches. So very quickly, all of a sudden, the only friends you've got are your political friends. So you gradually as well, you're told really not to be involved with people outside the far right because they don't see the complete picture. You know the true facts, you have a holy cause. I've done lots of things that I'm not proud of. Some have been violent, some have been emotional blackmail, some have been threats and intimidation. I tended only to lapse really towards the end, and it was a long process to sort of decide to leave. I was married at the time and my wife gave me an ultimatum, and she said basically, it's combat 18 or me, make your decision. I actually made the decision to stay with C18. At the time I thought really I was a soldier. I was either going to go to prison, I was either going to kill somebody or I was going to be killed. So the fact that she's gave me this ultimatum, for me at the time it was a simple, I'm a soldier, I'm in an army, I'm fighting a racial holy war. She went, and that was the very first thing when I actually sit back 6 months later and you go, what have I just done? I just thought, you know what, it's not about race or nationality, it's about individuals. So obviously I've decided to leave my house, leave my job, take a couple of K and then basically just head off to a different city. Lived above an Asian guy's shop and basically for a couple of years I just sat and went through that whole process. The guy was brilliant. I was doing all the hours God sent. He said I weren't eating properly, so I'd sit down with the Asian family, they'd feed me. And again, it was like, all these years I've been doing all this stuff, and I was just completely wrong. People look at me and they say, once a Nazi, always a Nazi. From where I am now and what I'm involved in, it's not an easy thing to tell somebody, I used to be in Combat 18, the National Front. For me, I just felt I had to put something back into the community. Communities don't have options and voices, whereas they can actually speak. I think that is the key. If we can sit down before people get to a violence and frustration because of poor election results, if we can actually talk about the things, then I think it will stop a lot of violence. If the politicians don't listen, the effect is extremism, and from extremism leads on to terrorism. So you need to allow pressure groups from whatever cause to be heard, and somebody needs to listen to them, because if you don't, you're just causing a massive problem.
I think these are two terrific films, and I think one of the things that demonstrated to me when I was watching them is that violent extremism doesn't have a brown face. So when we speak about combating violent extremism, the way it's been rolled out in this country is about just as a quick response to that. What are the sort of challenges that you've had in terms of reconfiguring the debate? So it's not just about Muslims, it's about other forms of extremism. Has that message been connected with decision makers that you've worked with?
I think it's a very organic space. So what happened around 9/11 to what's happening right now is very different. So the element of fear is a lot more heightened. We still see extremism, we still see terrorism as having one colour, one religion and one face. So we don't capture a lot of the complexities. So what, for example, Nigel had said in terms of communities don't have options or voices, I think that's really distinct, because communities still feel that they are still fending off what's being told, that you are responsible for this. So the options are still not there, the conversations are still not there as well.
Thanks very much for that. And just bring in Martha in. Martha, you've taken on the role as Director of Liberty, following on from Shami Chakrabarti earlier on this year. And we were speaking off stage for a moment, saying probably this has never been a better time for you to take on a job post-Brexit in terms of defending the values that liberty has propagated for so long. So considering and reflecting on John's speech and the films that we've seen, what are the challenges for liberty to promote its work in a very difficult and hostile climate?
Well, I think it's right to say that it is a hostile climate. I think we see that politically. I think we see it in parts of the press. I don't have a bleak vision of human nature. I do think that actually when you talk to individuals and families and communities, I do think there is real agreement around some fundamental values, things like tolerance, things like diversity, equality, fairness. I think where things get difficult is how you operate those principles in practice. And the operation of principles is always hard, and that's the stuff of daily life, and it's the stuff of daily policing or daily military operations or daily executive government. And there will always be debates, and I think the more open and the more passionate they are, the better. There will always be debates about where you draw the line. But I really do believe that there is this base level agreement that we as a nation are a civilized nation and want to continue to be a civilized nation, and that erosions of some of those fundamental values are very frightening. I think it's, of course, right to say that we live in times of quite extraordinary change. I hear and I probably agree with the suggestion that the history of the nation-state is an idea of creating something in opposition to some perceived existential threat. I think the challenge for this country going forward is to see whether we can define a nation, a new chapter in our history, not in relation to a perceived existential threat, but instead set out some kind of positive and principled vision for a future which may not be part of the European Union, but is still very much part of the world. And I think the title of this conference, The Ripple Effect, and the comments that Lord Alderdice made about imitative behaviours really resonate with me. One of the things that I think we've seen for many years, and I think it's wrong to see it as just isolated around the Brexit debate, is really a race to the bottom of much political rhetoric, particularly around the other, however you define it. And my very strong view is that that rhetoric has very real-world consequences, because it does give permission, it gives license on some level for behaviours that are imitative of the attitudes that are being espoused by often our leaders. And so, for example, over the years we have seen the development of a hostile environment policy for migrants here in the UK, and that's not me calling it a hostile environment policy, that is the name of the policy given to it by governments. We've seen the implementation of Prevent, and we can, I'm sure, have a conversation about the principles behind Prevent and its aims and objectives, but I think there is a growing consensus that it is not delivering in a way that is cohesive and unifying for communities facing difficult questions. We've seen a pretty pitiful response to the refugee crisis in this country, and in my view, at the rotten heart of all of this, we see every year 30,000 people being detained for administrative convenience indefinitely because they are immigrants here without status, and we are the only country in Europe that detains immigrants indefinitely. So I think when you take all of that together, you see a trajectory of scapegoating and demonising and isolating, and I think it is no wonder that as a result of that you see a rise in hate crime. And of course that rise in hate crime post-Brexit has been very well documented, a 47% rise, particularly racial hate crime. But that's only part of the story. Hate crime against BME groups and Islamophobic hate crime has been rising for years. And in the period July 2015 to July 2016, there was a 94% rise in hate crime, in Islamophobic hate crime. So there is a very grave problem in the way that we think we have a right to treat people in our communities. And I think that is an urgent question for everyone here to address, but also for our politicians to address. And we have to mobilise and activate and make our voices heard and tell our politicians that they do not have our permission to speak in this way and to give rise, therefore, to the hateful actions that we've seen in recent months and years.
But let me please play devil's advocate and ask the panel so generally that we speak about the toxic climate now in both sides of the Atlantic and elsewhere, but doesn't Brexit and the election of Donald Trump last Tuesday demonstrate that fear has indeed won over optimism in both combating violent extremism and cohesion. So because Brexit and Trump has been successful, haven't liberals lost the argument? And aren't we living in a post-liberal world? And as Lord Alderdice, I think, was hinting at, we need to reach out to the very people that we find so difficult in terms of whether they're extremists on both sides of the argument, to try and build that cohesive future. So haven't we just lost the debate? And haven't we got to get real as progressive people around these tough issues? So, Lord Alderdice, perhaps you can start off by that.
I think that that's where I feel we are. And when I've looked, for example, at Donald Trump, at the way he conducts himself, if you set aside the sexual side of it, I've seen it all before in a smaller scale with the rise of Ian Paisley in the United Kingdom.
Right.
The way he spoke, the dehumanizing way in which he dealt with other people, the bullying, the making fun of people in an unacceptable way, the purposely politically incorrect things that link in with a very large number of people and how they really feel and how they have not felt listened to for good reasons or ill. It's not the point. And the trajectory at home was that liberal people simply tried to criticize and laugh at and mock Ian Paisley. And in the end, he won. And there had to be a really serious review by liberally minded people about how you pull a community out of the trough of despond in light of that. And I think I'm not at the place where I'm saying here are the clever answers, but I think I am at the place of saying that liberally minded people need to take seriously, this has actually happened. This is not a threat. This is something that it has happened, is happening, and is going to get worse over the next period of time. And therefore people need to think very seriously about the implications of it. And I suppose what I was saying is, and some of the answers will not be as attractive as you might hope. And this is a group phenomenon. It's not about individual people. You go to individual people, they're delightful, perfectly pleasant, take old ladies across the street, even if they don't want to go, all of this kind of stuff. But when people are together in large groups, the psychology is different, and it's a different phenomenon. And so I take very much what you say, and I think we need to take it seriously.
Zubaida, doesn't Brexit show that people are really concerned about violent extremism, and they see the threat not from right-wing violent, the alternative right, but from the very people that we're trying to, as liberals, trying to bring into the country? So isn't there a point there that we need to close our borders because there is a threat from violent extremism, and most people think that it's coming from people with brown skins?
So I suppose it's a huge question in the sense of, we've got Brexit, we've got what's happening with America. I think it's really difficult because you can't actually say one is not the other. So when we say fear and the opposite of that, we can't say people who voted for Brexit are like this, for example, because again, what we're looking for is simplification. We want to try and understand, we want to make sense, but actually it's the simplification that's the problem, because we think we're on one side and the other means something else. So I think from that point of view, it's important that we don't get drawn into the binary of, one is hate, one is fear, and so forth. So that's the first thing. And I think that adds around the topic around extremism, for example, because again, we just want to look at bad guys from a point of view. When we talk about, for example, groups such as Al-Qaeda, groups such as ISIS, we think they represent something that is against us in terms of liberal democracy. And it's really easy then to sort of say they stand against our values. And I think one of the previous speakers talked about that. And I think if we're talking about empowering, Brexit will happen however it happens. Trump will happen and evolve in whatever way it will happen. But we're not then talking about what civil society looks like. And for me, that's where the grounded kind of hope has got to be. But what we have to do is get some of the people that we work with, teachers, where are the educators in this? Because at the end of the day, how we teach some of our future generations, it's about debate, it's about discussion. It's really important that we don't distill what is happening on the global stage in terms of a few social media postings. Because again, what's happened with discourse is that we only listen, we only read what enforces our kind of point of view as well.
I think it's a good point. And Martha, I mean, you're starting your tenure as Director of Liberty in this cold policy environment that we speak about. But how can Liberty and its work under your leadership get people on the people out there who vote on the right side of the debate in terms of where Liberty is concerned? Because clearly they are voting in a way that is, some people say against their interests, but they're voting for policy positions and issues that some would say Liberty is in the minority rather than the majority. So how do you go about that work?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, I think, as has been said, that you have to resist oversimplification. One of the most interesting pieces of polling that has been done after the referendum, I think, is by an organisation called British Future, and they look at attitudes towards migration. And they polled lots of people, and they found, unsurprisingly, that people are very worried about immigration. I don't think that comes as a shock to anyone in this room. I don't think it comes as a shock to any politician. But then they dug a little bit deeper to find out what it was that people were worried about. And one of the things that came up again and again was that people were worried that the government was out of control on immigration. That, of course, as we know, governments of all colours set targets that they probably know that they will never meet, and then, of course, they go on not to meet them. And they don't just not meet them by 500 or 1,000 people. They don't meet them by sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. And I think it's very understandable that what you want from your government is for your government to be in control of important things like immigration, like crime, law and order, the economy. And I understand that if what you see is time and again governments making promises that they cannot keep, I understand why that would give rise to a certain level of panic. And I understand why it would make people think there is something very wrong here and I'm going to have to take the law into my own hands because clearly those that I am voting for cannot discharge some of their fundamental responsibilities. The nuance in that bit of polling, I think, is key to understanding that people in this country are not hateful of migrants. They're not necessarily racist or xenophobic. What they don't like is politicians who set targets that they can never meet that then give rise to this sense of loss of control. And it's why Take Back Control was probably the best campaign slogan that's ever been invented, I think. So part of the job of civil society and of Liberty and of anyone who counts themselves as liberal or progressive or pro-human rights is understanding the nuance of these conversations and not tarnishing people with a very judgmental brush. I don't think we've lost the debate. I don't think we've won it either. I don't think we ever will either win or lose that debate. I don't have a view of history as being constantly moving towards a utopia. I think we will go backwards and forwards on these issues. That is the nature of having populist democracy. It is the nature of having multiple forces that impact on the way people make decisions. So I think we have to keep trying, and I think we have to keep appealing to people's better nature. I think we have to be robust critics of the way that we communicate and who we communicate with, and there's a lot to learn about doing that, and we need to be reflective. And I think it's right to say that we may not like some of the answers that we face, and we may face some very difficult conversations. The key thing is just to keep really, really trying, I think.
Trying indeed. I think one of the things that Lord Alderdice spoke about earlier on is that the West should not be seen as a shining example of moral rectitude. And with that in mind, given some of the people that Zubaida and her organisation works with, why on earth should communities who have been labelled as being problematic through restrictive immigration practices, through discrimination that's happened and documented in the post-war period, certainly in this country and elsewhere, why on earth should they be engaged with government of any hue in terms of combating violent extremism when they've been seen as a problem? So what can politicians do to engage with communities such as those?
It's a very difficult problem. And if I might pick up some of the things that Martha said, because I think she talked an awful lot, and I'm not surprised, she talked an awful lot of very good sense. But the one thing I would pick up is the problem for politicians. There is a fundamental problem with liberal democracy, and it's this. Increasingly, if you want to get elected, you have to promise people illusions. because people won't vote for the reality anymore. So you're quite right, Martha. Politicians promise people things that they probably know in their hearts, although, to be honest, in the heat of an election you believe all sorts of things about what you can deliver, but probably know in their hearts that this may not be deliverable, but kind of will try. But as it goes on, government after government after government, with people being promised things that are undeliverable, it really begs quite fundamental questions about liberal democracy, because liberal democracy is based on the notion that there's some kind of rational choice about electoral programs that people then hold to and hold people to account. In fact, people vote because of what they feel and what they feel about people and what they feel against other people. So I just want to make that point. This is a real challenge. And therefore, when we think about what we want to do by way of governance, we may need to engage with other countries that have a very different view about what taking the temperature of the population is about, rather than simply assuming it's all a matter of free and fair elections and separation of powers and all that kind of stuff. We need to engage in that conversation more globally, rather than think that our method is the answer, because it's not as simple as that. It's not as simple economically either.
I think you're absolutely right. And we had a classic example of that last Tuesday in America, where Donald Trump had a manifesto of change, and since then he's rowing back on a number of different issues. But Zubaida, in terms of your work, and I know from your organisation, the conversations that you've engaged with people who've supported violent extremism, what have they said to you in terms of their rejection of government and rejection of the processes of CVV, and even on the flip side of that, community cohesion, because they reject society as a whole? So I
think we look at, for example, if we look at people who've gone out into conflict, so former extremists, formers as we call them, one of the things that they emphasise is that they want the space to talk about their issues, about how they went into extremism, but also kind of their exit out of extremism. And the purpose for one of the videos, effectively, is that so that we have a space to have these conversations, because I think the first thing is that with returnees, and we have around 800 odd people who've gone out from the UK into conflict zones like Syria, how do we have the conversation so that it's not just about locking people up? It's actually about listening, being open to some of that listening. So one of the first things is a conversation, it's a space to have the conversations, but then communities keep emphasising to us, government keeps telling us about safe spaces, but where are they? We're not having these safe spaces. And with the PREVENT strategy, whilst it's there to protect all of us, some of the implications of some of the legal duties. So, for example, we've had the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act of 2015, which puts a duty on organisations such as schools, NHS and so forth. Public organisations have a duty now around, quote-unquote, around looking at extremism. Yep. And one of their worries is that what happens if we can't spot that extremist? What's the comeback for us as an organisation? Yep. And are they there as educators, as health workers? And so therefore the fear of spotting is really, it can be counterproductive from that point of view. And so, for example, when you have referrals within communities, 80% of those referrals are actually rejected into the channel scheme. So what does that mean for communities if you're a brown person from that point of view? If you're Muslim, if you've got, again, within the wider community around Islamophobia. So where is all our responsibility rather than just one community's responsibility as well?
I was just struck by the film that we saw, that both individuals said they made a note of it. They got a sense of belonging and belief for the vision that they had. And it seems to me that it rather sort of contrasted with the disconnection and lack of belonging that they had with mainstream society. And that's perhaps one of the challenges that we all face in this room, is how do we connect with people who have become disconnected and fragmented? And the messaging that people followed in Brexit and Trump, because it frames our debate, was very clear. It was very uncluttered. And Make America Great Again I think is an amazing slogan, because it harks to the past and it also pushes to the future, that we can repair things. Yes.
Just one thing to add to that. In terms of some of the videos, what you'll find is that they join these movements because it promises a solution that's instant, and they look outside of the democratic sphere. So, for example, around the far right, they were helping their communities, whatever that looked like, whether it's on the very basic things around food, clothing and so forth. because they feel outside of that system, and that's the challenge for us. How do we bring people back into that middle so that we are part of that belonging?
So we're going to finish in 5 minutes because we started the session late, but I want to bring Lord Allardyce back to sort of summarise very quickly one of the things. But before we do that, just Martha, a sort of question for you, a final question for you in terms of freedom, and liberty is literally about freedom. So to what extent are reduced levels of freedom the price worth paying for the reassurance and security? Because what's been clear recently is that people want safety, they want security, they want the fact that they can move around and feel that they are secure. So to what does liberty have a view on that? On what are the levels of freedom that, in a sense, can be curtailed to ensure security?
Well, I don't want to sound sort of slippery about it, but I don't accept the premise that freedom and security are diametrically opposed. I just don't think that's right. I think that was a very effective bit of political spin, particularly post 9/11, when governments all over the world made moves to radically reduce civil liberties in the name of security. And of course, everyone wants to be secure. And I talk about the things you want your government to be good at. Keeping you safe, protecting your life and your limbs, of course, is the central thing you need them to be good at. And at Liberty, we have never, ever, and never will advocate for things that will put people at risk. That is a very different conversation from the more nuanced debate that then needs to happen around the measures that governments seek to use in the name of security. So the prevent strategy is in the name of security, but actually we see that it is divisive and it is discriminatory, and that doesn't give rise to security. And similarly, we had an announcement a few weeks ago at the Conservative Party conference that British troops would opt out of their human rights obligations in future conflicts in the name of security, in the name of keeping you safe. But I can tell you that on the world stage, if we are saying that regardless of the Bar Hamoussa disaster, regardless of Abu Ghraib, and regardless of Guantanamo, we still think that we are entitled to opt out of our human rights obligations, that does not make us safer. That emboldens our enemies. So I don't think that premise is the right one. What I think instead you want is to have a conversation about how you have liberty and security in a modern state. And I think a lot of that is about having accountability. So people talk about being in this post-fact political era, and Lord Allardyce refers to this idea that you have to dangle illusions in front of people's eyes, and I think that's right. But I actually think post-fact is not as helpful a way of looking at it as post-trust. Yeah. For me, the problem is that our democratic structures, which are pretty fledgling when you look at the whole sweep of history, don't have a mechanism for really, truly holding people accountable. There is no way of holding Donald Trump accountable for the lies that he told when he was campaigning, and for the fact that now, despite the democratic mandate that he is rowing back on some things that people voted for. The same is true in the Brexit debates. On both sides, people told lies, and our democratic structures don't have a mechanism for holding them to account. And so I think that's one of the concrete things that we can take away from this conversation, which is about saying what people need to see is that their representatives, when they do mislead them or when they put their feet wrong, will be held to account. And so that's why we need to have legacy inquests from Northern Ireland. We need to understand the extent of British collusion in the Troubles, and we need to understand that so we can learn the lessons, because you can bet your bottom dollar that we will have seen the same tactics being played out in Iraq. And arguably, we didn't learn the lessons from the first conflict, and then they were replicated in the second. It's why we need to have an Orgreave inquiry. It's why Hillsborough was important. And I think that one of the ways of rebuilding trust in our democratic institutions is to start saying that you, the people, can have faith in the mainstream, because people in the mainstream are held to account when they let you down.
I think you, the people, is a very, very strong phrase, and I think we need to keep on repeating that. Zubaida, a very, very quick point before I ask Lord Allardyce to sort of summarise and chart the way ahead.
I think we've got to be prepared as communities, as organisations, to actually have difficult conversations about people, how they feel, and to kind of look at some of these, what we would look at kind of diametrically opposed concepts of liberty, whose rights, whose safety. But we've also got to talk about problematic things about, whether it's Islamophobia, whether it's kind of white working class groups who feel excluded from the system. Sure. We've got to have that space to have the discussion as well.
I'm going to ask, because you're such an adept politician, Lord Allardyce, I'm going to ask you to summarise before I just say the very last sort of closing remarks in terms of what we've discussed and sort of charting the way ahead in no more than a minute. It's all yours.
Flattery will get you anywhere. I think one of the dilemmas of the 20% or so of liberal metropolitans is that increasingly they have tossed to the side 2 out of the 3 main ways in which we keep society in place, culture and religion, and have focused on law as the way to maintain everything. And also have tended to suggest that all cultures and all religions are all relative and relatively unbelievable. I think that's a serious mistake in the broad sweep of humanity. It has not worked. And I'm not convinced that our processes of holding to account are bringing better people into public life. I think they are driving people out of public life.
Correct.
And so I think all of us, from whatever part of society or whatever part of the globe we come from, have got to reflect very seriously on the various contributions of culture, religion, and law together, not because all of them are of equal value or conviction, but all of them need to be considered and thought about much more seriously as a way of keeping us from breaking down into terrible, chaotic violence. My fear, and I think I may have said it last year, is that in 10 or 15 years' time, people will look back and say that the third global conflict started in 2010 or 29 or 28. In other words, we are already in it, and we have to work very hard to make sure it doesn't spin completely out of control and globalize.
It's very, very strong words, and I would say, in closing, there's a world to win out there for people. The debate is not over. And in politics, as we've seen in Brexit and Trump, and also since 9/11 and 7/7 and beyond, is that there's a world to win there. There are organisations, individuals, many of which are represented here in this room, and of course on this platform, that are doing terrific work. And what we need to do is to mourn the defeats, but we need to organise and engage. As Zubaida was saying, engage with people who feel excluded and put forward a compelling vision for them that works on the ground. So all that's left for me to do, because I do remember someone saying that a hungry mob is an angry mob. So you're going to be going to lunch very soon. But I'd like to thank Lord Allardyce, John Allardyce, Zubaida Limbada, Martha Spurrier for a terrific sort of last hour. And thanks very much for your introduction.